Good evening. This is Robert Whitley from McGill University in Canada, who's researched extensively on male suicide. Over to you, Rob.
Thank you so much for this invitation, and I'll try and keep to 15 minutes or so that this is digestible for the listener. So today I'm going to talk about male suicide, and my name is Rob Whitley. As Mike said, I'm an associate professor in the Department of Psychiatry at McGill University. I just wanted to start with a few key facts. Men account for around 75 to 80% of completed suicides, and these statistics are stable across most Western jurisdictions: Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand. So they account for the vast majority of suicides. We do know that the highest suicide rates are actually in middle-aged men, in the age category of 40 to 60. And there's a little spike in older men in their 80s. But these are the group of men who are most affected age-wise. And an important fact to state is that there was a period of declining rates of suicide in the late 1980s and 1990s. So male suicide was declining and decreasing, and this was considered good news, obviously. But since around 2006, 2007, and especially since the global financial crisis, which was 2007, 2008, rates of male suicide have started increasing again. And there's been a steady linear increase in male suicides from 2006 to the present. So we did see improvements, but sadly, these improvements have not continued over time. And we are seeing the problem worsening. And that has important implications for prevention because, for example, there's been lots of investment in attempts to try and help prevent suicide, and male suicide in particular. But the fact that the rates are increasing indicate that we do need a new approach, and that the old way of doing things and the current way of doing things isn't necessarily working. So there are many risk factors for suicide, and male suicide in particular, and it's very important to say that both at an individual level and at a population level, suicide is almost never the result of a single cause. We should not say X causes suicide or Y causes suicide. Suicide, like any complex health outcome, is usually determined by a range of risk factors which intertwine, and we talk about a web of causation or multifactorial causation. But what I wanted to do here, there are many risk factors, there have been many epidemiological studies looking at suicide. What I wanted to do here is talk about three of the most well-researched and well-established risk factors, really to keep some focus for this presentation. So the first one is mental illness. We do know that men with a mental illness have a much higher risk of suicide than men without a mental illness. And schizophrenia is probably the mental illness with the highest risk, but also depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, eating disorders, the other mental illnesses also have a high risk. People with those mental disorders have a high risk of suicide. And that's important to note, and I'll come back to that later in the presentation. The second risk factor, which I'd like to talk about today, is separation and divorce. We do know that divorced men and separated men have a higher risk of suicide than non-divorced married men and unmarried men. And this is especially a case where the divorce involves separation from children, which in 85% of cases is a fact for the men, that men generally do not get full custody of their children. And the typical arrangement we all know is that a man will see his children one weekend every 2 weeks, and occasionally in the summer and at Christmas, etc. And we do know that this is obviously a very significant problem for many men. If you've been accustomed to living in a household with your wife and your children, and often in a more pleasant, bigger house, that divorce often means that you move to a bedsit, you move to rented accommodation, you're separated from your children. There's still a social stigma associated with divorce. There can be financial issues for men involved because they often have to support, in a way, two households. They support their own household and then have to pay contributions to the mother to support her household. So there's lots of issues behind separation and divorce. But we do know that is a big risk factor for male suicide. And I have said many times before that reform of family law should be considered a male suicide prevention strategy, because so many suicides are linked to what's happening after separation and divorce. The third risk factor I wanted to talk about was job loss and unemployment, especially amongst blue-collar men and the kind of manual workers, men who work in manual trades. We do know that when you lose a job, again, this is usually an unwanted transition, same as a divorce or a separation, and it has financial consequences, it has social consequences, it has psychological consequences. Obviously, it means you lose income. It means you lose the kind of social support that you used to have at work. We know that work gives meaning, it gives purpose, it gives structure, it gives routine. And being unemployed typically means monotony, it means boredom, it means social stigma, it means loneliness. So we know this can be especially tough for kind of blue collar workers and manual workers, because often in the locales where there are, say for example, shipbuilding industry or mining in Newcastle or in Glasgow or Liverpool or in Yorkshire, places where there was a single industry or single factory or single plant underpinning the whole workforce, that when that goes, men with blue-collar manual trades may not be as adaptable in terms of their skills. Their market skills may not be as in demand or as required by the workforce as, say, a white-collar worker in London who's working in IT or in tech, who might be able to get a job very quickly in their own geographical locale. So this can be very tough on those men, and the statistics prove that right, that blue-collar men, less educated men, manual workers, when they lose a job and when they have a long period of unemployment, they have a higher risk of suicide. And really just kind of repeating a few of the things I just said about the three risk factors there are some transversal issues across those three risk factors. One is what I call social integration and social connection, and this builds on the theory of Durkheim, who was a famous French sociologist from the 1800s, who wrote a classic book on suicide that is still highly relevant today. If you're unemployed, if you have a mental illness, if you're a recently divorced dad who is living in a bedsit away from your children, you will typically be lacking some level of social integration and social connection. For example, we know people with mental illness still are highly stigmatized, especially more severe mental illnesses like schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, that there will be some level of avoidance by the general public, but also even by family and friends, that employers, landlords, these kind of important stakeholders in society might not want to know if you're coming to them saying, give me a job, give me somewhere to live. If you're somebody with schizophrenia, PTSD, there is discrimination, we know that. Like I said, for men who are divorced, they previously were usually integrated into their nuclear family network, but also into the family and friends of their spouse. Their children gave them social support. The men would often go to the school gates, drop their kid off, pick them up. They'd talk to the other parents at the school gate, give them some level of social networking. But that's also kind of taken away. And obviously for men who are unemployed, employment is a typical factor for social integration, but they can lack that social integration and connection. The second transversal factor there is meaning and purpose. So we know that work gives many people a meaning and purpose in life. We know that being a primary breadwinner at the head of a household, being a good father, a good husband, someone who's leading their family, can also bring a lot of meaning and purpose. And divorced men, unemployed men are lacking that kind of, can often be lacking in that meaning and purpose. And people with mental illness may find it hard to establish that in the first place. If you think the rates of unemployment for people with mental illness are much higher than people without mental illness, so that they're lacking in that original meaning and purpose in some way. And the third transversal issue is what I call the gap in services. So we have this knowledge that unemployed men who are divorced men with mental illness, have high rates of suicide. They have these issues that they find these transitions very difficult to cope with. But there are no male sensitive, or very few male sensitive services, very few services tailored to the male experience, which tap into the male proclivities for to help one another out, to take action, to look for solutions, and to work together to try and solve a problem. And I talk about that in my next slide. So I wanted to talk about a few health service issues. Now we've established the facts about suicide, we've established the risk factors. What can health services do, and what are they doing, and what are they not doing? It's very important to state that there are different modalities of healing. We know from cultural psychiatry, when we look at Aboriginal healing, we look at traditional healing in certain traditional cultures, we look at religious healing, but there are many different types of healing. It's certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution for people who are undergoing mental stress and mental issues. But the official mental health system typically offers a limited slate of options. And typically it's really two options. One is medication, which is quite a quick fix and doesn't necessarily solve underlying issues. And the second is what we call talking therapies or psychotherapies, which are certainly very helpful but have very long waiting lists. Some research shows that there are many men who don't really like the kind of face-to-face formal setting of talking to a psychotherapist, going to the psychologist's office and talking about their feelings and emotions. And instead of saying, well, these men are stubborn and these men are the purveyors of toxic masculinity and these men need to learn to be more in touch with their emotions, we should actually start thinking, well, maybe we need to talk about reforming the mental health system and providing more options so that we make the mental health system comprehensive enough that people can find their place in it. And building on the work of John Barry and Martin Seeger and others who have been working in men's mental health for many years, we do know from research that men tend to prefer action-based, shoulder-to-shoulder type interventions or programs. So shoulder-to-shoulder means, you know, a man is more likely to bond with somebody, is more likely to talk about their life and their experience, and more likely to open up when they are in a shoulder-to-shoulder activity rather than a face-to-face activity. And we all can think of the examples. When you're driving in a car with a family member, you might have a more meaningful conversation than if you're sat across a table at a restaurant. When you're going for a walk with somebody, you're hiking, who's walking in the park, you get that kind of camaraderie. When you're repairing stuff together, you're doing stuff in the garden, in the yard, etc. So these kind of shoulder to shoulder, with that knowledge, there have been many programs which have tried to base themselves on shoulder to shoulder programs, and also programs which involve an action more than just simply talk to me, tell me about your feelings. But men like to engage in activities. They like to go in the garden, they like to repair bikes, they like to go for a walk, they like to climb trees when you were younger, they like to go camping, etc. And so do many women, so we should make some of these interventions available for people so there's real choice in the system. And I've given a few examples there. Men's sheds, which are a well-known intervention, which are, I call a kind of like a youth club for older men. Older men can go there and they repair bikes, they do metal work, they do gardening together, they sometimes do cooking together. Men who have experience in one domain will teach men who don't have experience in that domain, and then those men will teach other men some experience that they have. It could be computers, it could be IT, it could be woodwork, it could be metalwork, it could be gardening, it could be writing. So everyone has a role to play. And these men's sheds have been shown to be very helpful in early interventions for men's mental health. Another example I put there is recovery colleges. So recovery colleges are kind of like an adult education college where people with mental health issues can go and learn new skills and take courses. And these courses are often tailored to people's situation. So you could have a course for people with schizophrenia on how to manage a household budget, or a course on men who maybe have recently been divorced about how to deal with the legal system. Courses on how to plan a monthly healthy diet for yourself. So again, some evaluations show that these are very helpful, these recovery colleges. And the final example I gave there is what we call bushcraft interventions or wilderness interventions. This involves men going out into the woods or out onto an island or into the forest, camping, fording streams, building fires, maybe catching fish, even hunting some animals that they'll eat later, and with a purpose of kind of being a bonding experience and somewhat talking about mental health at some point, or building that kind of trust. But that's not the primary goal, it's kind of a secondary goal. And some early evaluations show that these bushcraft interventions can also be very helpful. We're not talking about going in the wilderness for months or even weeks. It could be an overnight or 2 nights and some kind of regular activity. And these have been called health by stealth interventions because they take an angular approach to health promotion and health education. They're not in your face, literally or metaphorically. And I've written about this. I've just published a book called Men's Issues and Men's Mental Health, which was published by Springer in 2021. I have a whole chapter devoted to male suicide, and a whole chapter devoted to the kind of interventions which are promising and we need to start funding and thinking about more carefully. My final point on this slide is that the few promising programs that are available, men's sheds, recovery colleges, they're often underfunded. They're often run by informal collectives, which is a strength, really, not a weakness, in a way that they're run by volunteers who are really committed to the program. They're not necessarily employees of the state who are just doing it to pick up a wage, or by kind of civil society organizations. And I've written myself here in the UK, I wrote an article with a member of parliament here in Canada where we proposed we should give 5-year block funding to these kind of informal collectives and civil society organizations who are offering useful programs for men's mental health and mental health in general, because they often have insecure funding. There's no central staff who can help out, and they're doing a lot of good work, but sometimes they collapse or they fold in on themselves due to this lack of support. That's my book that I talked about earlier. So everything I've said so far in this presentation is available in there, and it's well referenced. It's over 100 references, so people can look up what I've been saying. And just to conclude, there's a lack of male-friendly and male-sensitive programs and supports. Well, we see that in Canada, we see that in the UK, we see that in Australia. Those that do exist, like I said, are often coming from civil society organizations, from informal collectives, from bottom-up organizations, which is great, actually. I've talked about how Edmund Burke wrote about the little platoons of society in some of my writing, and how these are well placed to help out people in distress and in need. And we need to take advantage of these little platoons, but these little platoons need some kind of secure funding, and they need some help. The second bullet point there is the need to focus on the negative impact of unexpected life transitions and provide appropriate supports. Like I said, losing a job, suddenly getting divorced, maybe a bereavement, leaving the military, being discharged from the military. These life transitions, some of them are unexpected, can be very difficult times in a man's life. And there's not really any appropriate support beyond a few peer support organizations here and there, which again are doing a valiant job in trying to help, but are often underfunded and undersupported. And we need more services and more help with the men who are undergoing these kind of events. And finally, the importance of what I call a strengths-based rather than a deficit-based approach to men's mental health. We need to build on the strengths of men who are having mental health issues, mental distress, and not berate them or judge them and use phrases like toxic masculinity or male privilege or patriarchy. We need to, many men who have mental health issues, they've been very good family members, good employers, they've been good citizens, they've learned many skills in their life, and they're now undergoing an issue or a problem. We need to identify those strengths and build on those strengths instead of taking a judgmental, finger-wagging, victim-blaming approach, which, like I said right in my first slide, male suicide has been rising since 2006. And in a way that has been analogous, parallel with the the rise in this kind of discourse, which some people have identified as anti-men or as attacking men or pointing the finger at men. It's a correlation. Correlation does not equal causation, but is it a factor that could be behind some of the other issues? For example, the lack of support, the lack of services, the lack of funding. It could be an issue, and we need to talk about it more. So thank you, Mike, for the very kind invitation. I admire the work that you and the APPG are doing. I'm always available to talk more about this topic, and my email is there for anybody who would wish to contact me.